Welcome back, APUSH students. Today is Chapter 5 of the American Pageant, titled Colonial Society on the Eve of Revolution. If you aren't using the pageant, it's fine because the content is still going to be the same. I'm going to go over all the key terms and notes for this chapter that helped me get a 5, so I encourage you to take notes as well. First are the Paxton Boys. These are protests led by Scots-Irish people against oligarchy and colonial control. Many of the people involved in these protests became leading revolutionaries and the future leaders of the United States and the American Revolution as a whole. Jean de Crevecoeur was a French settler in America. He posed a question that created a new American identity, one separate from England. So if you ever get a question talking about American identity, talk about Jean de Crevecoeur. The New York Slave Revolt was a revolt in 1712 claiming both white lives and black lives. It demonstrated the slaves' desire for freedom and how they were oppressed from that freedom and how they were willing to fight for it. The Stono Slave Revolt, another slave revolt, a revolt in Carolina where slaves tried to march into Spanish Florida. It demonstrated the tight control over slaves that the South had because they wouldn't let them leave. They stopped them very quickly. Triangular trade was a profitable trade route involving 3 areas. You'll see a diagram of this at some point between Africa, the Old World, and the New World. This was an infinitely profitable trade strategy because it just kept going in a cycle, in a triangle, and it made the New England ports rich, the slave traders rich, and the Old World rich. So it just worked for everybody except, of course, the slaves. The Molasses Act was an act passed by Britain limiting colonial trade to France, another act from the British Crown limiting what the colonists could do economically. The Americans' response, which was, of course, as always, to defy the British law, led to the conflict in the American Revolution. You can just loop this in with all the other acts that the colonists rebelled against. Taverns were kind of hangout recreational areas along travel routes, lots of drinking, the colonists loved their beer. And it symbolized democracy and became the hub of political talk and the sharing of revolutionary ideas. So if you ever have anything in your essay about how American Revolution started amongst the colonists, talk about how they convened and conversed politically in taverns. Established churches were Congregational and Anglican churches in America, churches basically with influence from the British. And people in America rejected these churches, which gave England less control over the colonists, because they're already losing control and trying to, of course, gain it back economically, and now they were losing religious control as well. Arminianism was the idea that people were not predestined but could go to heaven if they lead a good life under God. This was a separatism from Puritan beliefs. It rejected the old-time and traditional religious ideas, making a more liberal and progressive outlook in religion. The Great Awakening, not as important as the Second Great Awakening, but it was a revival of religion in America in the 1730s and 40s. It inspired colonists to be more religious and encouraged them to lead a good life under God, regardless of church membership, led to a greater sense of common American identity. It wasn't just Puritans or Catholics, it was just a common American identity of doing good and leading a good life. Jonathan Edwards was a theological preacher who ignited the Great Awakening. He was so talented at speaking and preaching that it was adopted by other people, which just spread the Great Awakening even more and spread American identity even more. Old Lights versus New Lights was a conflict between 2 groups that disagreed over the Great Awakening. The Old Lights obviously were the old traditionalists, and the New Lights were the people encapsulated by that Great Awakening thought. Their disagreement symbolized how the Great Awakening was a threat to the traditional church and how the church was modernizing into its own American way. Phyllis Wheatley was a formerly enslaved poet brought to Boston and then all the way back to England. She was a symbol for disadvantaged people in America, that they could become successful, but don't get too carried away with this person in essays and short answers, because still the majority of disadvantaged people were not becoming successful. Poor Richard's Almanac was an almanac written by Ben Franklin. It had tremendous influence on American character, so another thing that you can bring up when talking about American identity in this time is Poor Richard's Almanac. The Zenger trial was when a newspaper printer was brought on trial for criticizing the New York governor. He actually won the trial, which set a precedent in America for freedom of the press and the protection of free and public discussion, basically legalizing truthfulness, even if it offends somebody. And that's a wrap. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next chapter. Goodbye.